Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Kaufman from Read Russia, and this is the third day of Russian Literature Week. Thank you all very much for coming. Some good friends I see on this, and welcome to everyone. This is a new project for us to do Russian Literature Week all online, which we're doing because of the pandemic, and the pandemic is also influencing some of our themes. This year. When we started posting information on social media about Russian Literature Week, someone commented and said, "Isn't every week Russian Literature Week?" And I guess that's a fair thing to say. I wanted to respond every day is Russian Literature Week, but we can discuss that too. We have a full program of activities this week, and today is the busiest day of all. There are 4 events. One is pre-recorded in the evening, and this is our first today. And so with that, I would like to welcome Gary Saul Morson and Morton Schapiro to kick us off. A brief introduction. Gary Saul Morson is Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities, Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Northwestern. I think all of you know Professor Morson's work, but it ranges as he writes over a variety of areas: literary theory, the history of ideas, both Russian and European, a variety of literary genres, and his favorite writers, Chekhov, Gogol, and above all, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. He's especially interested in the relationship of literature to philosophy. Professor Morton Schapiro is the 16th president of Northwestern University. He began his term there September 2009. He's also professor of economics in Northwestern's Judd and Marjorie Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, and also holds appointments in the Kellogg School of Management and the School of Education and Social Policy. He is among the nation's leading authorities on the economics of higher education, so he must be busy these days, with particular expertise in the area of college financing and affordability, and on trends in educational costs and student aid. Previously, he was president of Williams College from 2000 to 2009. We are exceptionally grateful to these 2 speakers who joined us today to speak about their work, their courses that they teach together at Northwestern, and in particular their newest book. Everyone knows Zoom protocols. Please stay on mute if you can. Comment in the chat, and at the end of, say, 35-40 minutes, I think we'll move to question and answers. Please, gentlemen, take it away.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's an honor to be here with such an illustrious group. And as we were chatting, as people were entering from the waiting room, Saul and I have a new book called Minds Wide Shut: How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us, that will be out in a couple of months. And based, Saul, on the book we did 3 years ago, Sense and Sensibility, What Economics Can Learn from the Humanities, we did a lot of talks, and I think we got better. So I'm hoping, Peter, that we start off at a higher level than we did for Sense and Sensibility, because our first podcasts and talks were really all awful. And by the time the paperback came out, a year later, now 2 years ago, we kind of got it going. So this is, I'm sorry, Peter, the first time when we heard from you a couple of weeks ago, and we said, yeah, the book's not even out till February, but sure, it'll be a chance for us to learn. And one of the key themes, Saul, of course, is that Russian literature can teach us about, not just about empathy, but also about history and about economics. And as you pointed out, Peter, I'm an empirical labor economist. I think everybody in the audience knows Saul is one of the great scholars in Russian literature, as you said, philosophy, history, culture, and the like. So let me start, Saul, turning to you. Peter alluded to the fact that we've been teaching together, and we have an undergraduate course that, God willing, will be going in about a month. I think it'll be the 11th year in a row we've taught that course. This is also our third book together, one edited and two that we've written not as edited, but as the authors. So it's the old joke, Saul, a Russian literature professor and empirical economist go into a bar. What the hell do they talk about?
Well, everything we've done, the books, the class, are based on the notion of dialogue. And if you keep your Bakhtin in mind, you'll get the spirit of this. The idea in the class is that each discipline, economics, literature, and others that we talk about, can be best understood if you see them not only from the inside, but from the outside. So we set up the classes that we do as a conflict of disciplines. Genuinely, each one reflects on the other. This is, of course, how Bakhtin described the spirit of dialogue. And then we would, in these classes, really argue with each other and bring our different perspectives to bear. And as in real dialogue, there wasn't a single monologic answer. And we really believe in that spirit. And the current book came out of the fact that everywhere around us, we including in the university, we see it threatened by what Bakhtin would call a vigorous monologism, or what here we called a kind of fundamentalism. And we're hoping that the spirit of Bakhtin and someone who plays a big role in the class, Isaiah Berlin, with his notions of pluralism, will offer a kind of Russian antidote to what's going on, so that we have that rather than the worst of the Russian experience.
So let me get back to quickly, what's the elevator speech or pitch about Sense and Sensibility? A number of the reviews, and we were fortunate to get widely reviewed, from the New Yorker to Harvard Business Review, from full page in the Wall Street Journal to the Washington Post, and a number of them called it a rather scathing critique of the current status of the field of economics. I'm a proud economist. Why do you hate us?
Well, we're still talking about Sense and Sensibility.
Yeah. Give me 1 minute about Sense. It's out in paperback. Somebody might be fooled into buying it.
Yeah, that's right.
Peter might buy it. He's got a lot of books behind him. He's got room for Sense.
Well, economics tends, at least many economists tend to think of themselves as having the answers to all social questions. If you ask economists, do they have anything to learn from other disciplines? I think, Morty, you found this statistic, something like, 63% said they had absolutely nothing to learn.
Well, it's even worse. So there was a survey of US professors a couple of years ago, and they asked them, can you learn anything from another field? So I don't know, Peter, if they ask you Russian literature, can you learn from other fields? You'd probably say, sure, from history, from philosophy, from whatever. And it turned out 79% of psychology professors said, bring it on. I could be a better psychology scholar and teacher if I learned from other fields. Similar numbers of sociologists and historians, but Saul, it was only 42% of economists said there is anything they can learn from any other field, which is truly amazing, Saul. 58% said no. And then among the 42% who were then asked, okay, what's the field you can learn from? Is it psychology because your models are naive? Is it political science because you're so bad at figuring out political trends? Is it history because when you do historical stuff, you usually butcher it? And what was the field that the 42% of economists believe they can learn from and should embrace? What was the field?
Overwhelmingly, they picked finance, which most of us...
It's mathematical economics, thank you. So not exactly what we had in mind in the book. So what did we have in mind in the book? And what's the Sense and Sensibility? Say something about the cleverness of that title.
Well, it's Sense, C-E-N-T-S, and Sensibility. And, it's the dialogue between, the thinking of economics, the sense, and outside perspectives that you can get from literature and philosophy that would call into question some of the key assumptions of economics. Of course, we did the reverse too, the way in which, and even more in the present book, the way the humanists could learn something from the economists as well, although the emphasis is on what the economists can learn from the humanists.
And so the new book, you mentioned it is connected. It's about dialogue, and there's even some stuff about re-examining and reinterpreting Adam Smith that's even carried over from one book to another. But it's mainly about the lack of empathy, that people are screaming at each other and people are in their silos, and some are watching just CNN and some are watching Fox and some are reading this and some are reading that. And, there's the righteous indignation abounds and all that kind of stuff. And that's sort of what the book's about. But, the subtitle is How the New Fundamentalisms Divide Us. And since the word fundamentalist or fundamentalism, Saul, is used in such a promiscuous way to, define Saul, as you wrote that great line in the book, everything you don't like, you call them a fundamentalist. So, what are the basic tenets, if you will, of what you define as fundamentalism?
Well, I learned when, working on genres that you really need to specify how you're using a term, or what will happen will be you will slip from one definition to another as convenient. This happens in discussions of, what is literature, what is a novel, and almost anything. So you really need to pin it down and not say however the word is used is okay. Specify how you are using it and keep to it. So we specify in one of the chapters 3 criteria which will identify fundamentalism as we use the term, not as historically having been used. I mean, historically, of course, it goes back to a group of pamphlets published between 1910 and 1915 on the basics of defending the basics of Christianity against the higher textual criticism, called the fundamentals, and then their opponents called them the fundamentalists at a later point. There's some overlap with that, but it's not what we're talking about. We mentioned 3 criteria. One is the sense of absolute certainty in the system you have. These are Isaiah Berlin's hedgehogs. You have, you can get it from revelation. You can get it from a claim of science. Of course, these wouldn't be sciences, they would be pseudosciences, but you just leap to the claim because in our world, science plays the role that revelation played at one point. You can't question it. So, the history of from, Condorcet to Marx to Freud to Skinner of false social sciences allows the people to claim a kind of certainty. And one of the ways you can tell is that there is no, everything is equally certain, which is never the case in a real science. And, some things are better established than others. That's how it can progress. It is in motion and it's open to falsifiability. Whereas if you look at, the kind of things we call fundamentalism, contrary evidence is ruled out in principle in advance by one method or another. So certainty is definitely part of it. And Morty, there are some economists who still think of their, discipline in that way. The one we teach in our class, Gary Becker is, who's a brilliant economist, but he, as hedgehogs very often are, but it happens there too. So the second criterion we identified is what in the literature is called the perspicuity of truth. That is, the idea is that truth is there, it's available, it's naturally intelligible, and the human mind is perfectly adapted to understanding it. At Marx's funeral, Engels said, just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so did Marx discover the laws of human nature. The idea is that what you have to do is look at the world and in the right way, and it will reveal itself to you. This is very different from what a skeptic would see. You understand? A skeptic would talk about all the ways in which, prejudices, bias, self-deception, the what H.G. Wells called the problems of the instrument. If you think in Darwinian terms, you know that the mind did not evolve to reach truth perfectly. It evolved for whatever would be the best survival, right, in a short term. There's no reason to think that that means it's guaranteed to be adequate to the world. Greek tragedy, for example, is based on the notion that it isn't. And you say, why would you think it is? And that goes back to notions like what you get in Descartes, that God would not have created the human mind in any other way that it could know the world. But it's really interesting that people who are completely secular, who wouldn't accept that notion, still take the same view of the relation of the mind to the world. They've constructed a kind of God substitute right there. And this is where the fundamentalism comes in. The truth is perfectly clear to those who look at it. Then if you ask, why then do people disagree? Why doesn't everybody see your truth? Some version of the notion of false consciousness will come up. That is, they would if they weren't completely blinded by something. We're not, but they are. So that's would be the second criterion. And the third would be, and these you don't have to have all of these together, but the third will be the existence of a foundational inerrant text or revelation. Obviously, the Bible, in some cases, economists have a tendency, though to read it, to pick Adam Smith as a kind of foundational text. Obviously, the works of Marx and Engels can be such a thing. What's really interesting here is that when students of religious fundamentalism discovered that when various Asian religious groups wanted to adopt this spirit, they had to create texts like this. They had to take an epic poem and turn it into an infallible religious text, which shows the need, the need for it. So those are the three criteria of this kind of thinking. It's always a temptation because it puts you in the morally superior and intellectually perfect position. But sometimes it's going to be more in evidence and a greater temptation than others.
So Saul, given the expertise of the viewers today, I want to move in a minute to the Russian/Soviet context, because as I think I mentioned before, that Russian literature, history, economic debacles over the last century or so, have informed the new book in a way that no other country, no other literature, no other history, or no other rise from, well-meaning liberalism to totalitarianism does. So I want to get to that. Before I do that, though, I want to mention somebody we both learned from and we're friends with, Steve Toulmin, whose name might also be familiar with Peter and others. So as an alternative to fundamentalism, Toulmin pushed forward, tried to resurrect case-based reasoning. Can you say just a few words about that? Then I want to ask you specifically about the Russian context.
Yeah, Toulmin's idea was that the story of modernity usually is a straight line from 16th to 17th century, from people like Montaigne to Descartes, but he wanted to make it two different lines. One would be the one that leads to hedgehogism, the claim of that you have an absolutely certain system, which you get in the 17th century rationalists. But the other is that the world is too complex for that. It doesn't fit pattern. That's what you get in Montaigne and Shakespeare. And he thought that the trend, the dominance in philosophy of the pure rationalist trend had led to a dead end, particularly with regard to ethics. And we needed to revive the earlier trend, which was based not from certain axioms reasoned down, but from the complexity of experience. And with that, generalizations are less certain than what you get by looking at a sensitive view of experience. I guess you can say, in our field, a sensitive reader will get a text better than someone who just has a theory and applies it to a text. But that's true of ethical questions as well. And there's a whole tradition of case-based reasoning in ethics, which goes from the bottom up. and is very similar, for example, to what you get to learn when you diagnose in clinical medicine. You look for syndromes. Your judgments are, things that tend to go together, but don't have to. You don't have laws, you have rules of thumb, good ways of looking at things. You acquire experience. There's no guarantees, but you get more and more sensitive as you go on and reflect on your experience. That's how the tradition of case-based reasoning works with ethic or with anything clinical or practical reasoning. So that's one alternative to fundamentalism, as dialogue is another.
So in the book, we have 4 long chapters on politics, economics, religion, and literary analysis. And as I said before, Russia is all over all 4 of those, not just, I think, because of your incredible expertise, but because they really personify what could go right and what could go wrong in literature and politics and economics and the like. So let me start with the politics. And, we talk about, it's called The Politics of Hate. We talk about how the revolution devours its children, that fundamentalist ideology encountering no resistance can lead to unimaginable horrors. Once the intelligentsia condones the excesses, what we call the slide begins. So, again, recognizing the expertise of the people watching you right now, talk a little bit about how the experience over the last 120 years or so in this former Soviet Union really helped us make that argument about the horrors of fundamentalism in politics.
Yeah, what's really interesting, it's not just the kind of politics you're all familiar with, from Solzhenitsyn and others, but I really have always been fascinated since I was an Oxford student studying the history of dialectical materialism, the way in which scientific theories were judged by their conformity to Marxism-Leninism. So that's pretty when quantum mechanics was rejected. Of course, we all know about genetics being rejected, period relativity was rejected. You have an absolute certainty. As Lenin said, Marxism must be taken as a whole. There is no possibility. If you get rid of one little piece, the whole block. That's, of course, precisely the sign of a pseudoscience, not a science, although he would not have thought that. Where did this come from? It's already present in the 19th century radical intelligentsia. But lots of examples. And what you got was, particularly during the revolution, was, we think of as a slide. You don't have to have a majority of people who think like Lenin. The Bolsheviks, of course, were a very small minority. But when you have a certain mentality, as in the French Revolution, and Lenin, of course, had studied it, things tend to accelerate in the same direction because, your Girondists get executed, your Mensheviks get thrown out, because it's always dangerous and feels morally wrong not to be the one to say, wait a minute, this is going too far. It won't happen, you see, once the slide begins, because no one's going to stick their neck out at that point, not only because they're afraid, but because they actually wonder whether, just as they criticize people who at an earlier stage, they themselves are, this is the whole point of Arthur, Koestler novels. On what possibility could Bukharin or Trotsky object to violence against opponents? They had supported it themselves. So the slide continues, and so when you get that, you will wind up with a situation like the Soviets. And indeed, it continues after the revolution. That's what Stalin meant by the intensification of the class struggle after the revolution. It sounds paradoxical, because there's nobody to oppose anymore, but that's precisely the dynamic that takes place. Precisely because there's no one to oppose. There's nothing to stop it.
And so moving quickly to economics, and then I want to end up with literature, and Peter, give 15 minutes or so to people to ask us questions, you and others, at least 15 minutes. In economics, again, my field, most of us are trained to be pretty much market fundamentalists, and which we define in that chapter, Saul, is not just believing that markets work. I believe markets work, but the basic training is markets always work, and you want to protect property rights and internalize negative externalities, the Coase theorem and the like. But other than that, you leave things alone. It's a misreading, of course, of Adam Smith's Wealth and Nations, 1776. Laissez-faire is very different the way it's taught in basic econ textbooks versus what Adam Smith wanted, particularly if you engage with his earlier thing, the theory of moral sentiments 17 years earlier, which he did not denounce as called the Adam Smith problem, but at his deathbed thought was at least as important as his subsequent Wealth of Nations. But again, there is the markets always work, and then there's markets never work. And you were just talking about politics. I make the point of not just about economics here, but a more general one that fundamentalism isn't owned by the right. In fact, recent history would suggest, and what you just said about Soviet history, it's on the left as well as the right. So it's not it's
a temptation
viewpoint. So say something about that, but also tell us a little bit about the Soviet experience. And we argue in here that wouldn't it be ironic, just as a number of formerly planned economies move towards markets to allocate scarce resources, some of the long-standing proud market-based economies seem to have a growing skepticism about whether markets can really lead to just outcomes. So say a few words about that.
Yeah, fundamentalist lines of thinking are more likely on the extremes, both right and left, but of course they can exist anywhere. And part of the book deals with actually the developments in the Soviet economy and what they thought they were doing. And the period we usually are taught to be called war communism, that was a term applied after it had failed in order to say, well, it was only temporary. But while it was there, it was not thought to be temporary. It was thought to be an immediate transition to communism. It would be very simple to do. Money would be abolished. The way they were going to do that was by extraordinary inflation, and which they did to the points of billions of percent. What's the alternative to market ways of allocating resources? There is only one, as Lenin and Trotsky both emphasized, and that's coercion. And so what you got was Trotsky was Minister of War, also became in charge of labor armies. That was soldiers who were released from being a soldier were drafted into a labor army where, again, if you were late for work, you'd be court-martialed or shot. It was military discipline in labor. And that was to be the long-term ideal. If you have to, what is the alternative to market? Well, when they backed off that, they never really did find a good one. And the kind of ways in which they allocated resources by the plan, we discussed various ways of why it wouldn't work and why obvious solutions couldn't be chosen for ideological reasons, because it would bring you too close to a market. When Lenin said they should shoot speculators on the spot, by a speculator, his meant was anyone buying and selling. And part of what the Soviet experience in its extreme form led to was, shows is why a market mechanism is far superior. And even in the softer forms of later, the obvious economic problems led to that. So, on the one hand, we talk about the kind of market fundamentalism that you'll get in some University of Chicago economists, which again it doesn't lead to gulags, but it ideologically blinds you to other much better solutions. Of course, the Soviet thing, which we're more familiar with on the other side.
Of course, Milton Friedman would have had something strong to say about what you just said. But anyway, two of the casualties within my field, economics, of fundamentalism. One, economics is about trade-offs. I mean, that's what it is. Scarcity gives rise to trade-offs. You quote the Russian critic Belinsky for that great. So say something about fundamentalism and tying it to Russian literature, and about whether they believe in trade-offs. And the other thing is that what I really love about my field is we're really remarkably straight about analyzing data. And our other book, and even this one, has some examples of work that I've done, empirical studies that came up with a finding that was really not what I expected and not what I hoped, and didn't make it easier for me to do my day job as president of this place, but nonetheless, we published it. So two of the casualties are, one, skepticism about trade-offs, and then two, as I think you mentioned, Karl Popper, if something isn't falsifiable, then it has no value. So two things quickly about that, and I want to end up with Russian literature.
Yeah, Zielinski liked to quote that Latin proverb, fiat justitia pereat mundus, let justice reign though the world perish. You do not compromise. It's not a matter of trade-offs. You don't, you just have the total solution regardless, because any compromise is immoral. This mindset, which of course defined the radical Russian intelligentsia, is precisely the contrary of the notion of what you need in democracies, which is compromise, different interests, the idea that you are not absolutely sure what is absolutely right, and therefore you have to take other opinions into account, and that there are trade-offs. To get one thing, you have to give up another. And that's what this mindset doesn't recognize. If you start looking this way, in a fundamentalist way, essentially a religious way at problems, you wind up with bad solutions. We talk a lot about solutions to climate change. And the difference between thinking in terms of the most efficient way using trade-offs and thinking religiously, essentially religiously, which makes any carbon use a sin, and thinks essentially that way. So one of the reasons that while Germany, which has signed on to all the climate agreements, has committed himself to reducing carbon, has not reduced carbon at all. It's because it simultaneously eliminated nuclear power. Whereas the US actually, which has defied all such agreements, did actually reduce it because of the switch, because of fracking from oil to natural gas, which provides more energy per unit of carbon. Now, we used to see buses that say, we run on clean natural gas. You don't see them anymore, because the idea now is that any fossil fuel is a sin, and you don't go from replace one sin with another if you're thinking that way. But, if the difference, also the view towards nuclear power, I mean, for all its agreement, for all its difficulties, if you really think the world is in danger in 10 or 15 years, the problem of nuclear waste in 5,000 years is not going to weigh as much. But if you think of it as a sin, you ban it anyway, no nukes. That's what it did in Germany. Whereas contrast it with the Finnish Green Party, which is pro-nuclear, precisely because it doesn't release carbon. You have trade-offs.
So a final question before we open it up and learn from the viewers. I guess the single thing that's most in common between Sense and Sensibility and the new book, Minds Wide Shut, is that we believe, whether it's an economic problem, a political problem, a social problem, that literature can help us, lead us from the wilderness into salvation, specifically Russian literature. Why?
Yeah, those of you who know my work know that I see the realist novel, of course, of which the Russians were the best, as a genre that not only has casuistry at its roots, you see that when it's explicit at the end of, let's say, Anna Karenina, but also relies on the idea of understanding different points of view. That's what Bakhtin's whole theory of the novel about different points of view being orchestrated is based on that notion. You understand a person unlike yourself when you can see them from within. That's what free and direct discourse is designed to do. You see the world from the perspective of someone of a different social class, a different gender, a different country, a different religion, worldview, everything. And you understand much more about what it's like to be human from that kind of empathy, both emotional and intellectual. And the author who we, of course, focus on the most, precisely because our theme is is empathy is Chekhov, because that of course is such an extraordinary value in him. Empathy and the failure of empathy, of course, are his great themes. So he comes off as kind of the hero of the book.
And hence the last chapter, rather than reiterate all the things about the rise of fundamentalism and the common reasons why they show up in a variety of different fields and what you can do about it, we just go to one of Chekhov's great short stories, Enemies, a story I'm sure familiar to you, Peter, and many of the other viewers right now. And we just go through that, and that's the end of the book. And we argue that is the alternative to fundamentalism, to truly, I mean, that's obviously a short story that about the failure to empathize, that, you know, the common sadness and outrage could have brought us together, but it pushed us apart. You know, one of Chekhov's great lines, and I butchered it, but you could do it in Russian there, Saul. But and that's the end of the book. And I'm sure that some of the reviewers, hopefully in the Times and Journal, are going to say, "Why another kind of wacky book by Saul and Morty?" You know, ending up not with even a summary, but, you know, a 10-page description of why Chekhov can teach us something no one else can. So with that, Peter, we have 20 minutes as promised.
I'll just say,
up to you and
Carol Lonio here, who knows that story so well. Sorry.
Thank you so much. I just want to say that now we know why the Northwestern football team is so good, because obviously you both go in there and, you know, in the locker room and just give them a pep talk like this before every game. It's evident. I have a question about your and Bakhtin's vigorous monologism, or what I gather you call or the new fundamentalism. Because you invoke I haven't read the new book. You invoke clinical medicine a bit in your talk today. And I wonder, I'm just going to say that we, you know, for Russian Literature Week or Read Russia, we say, you know, Russian literature, it's not the vaccine, but it's the next best thing. We're trying to promote a new bumper sticker for that. But like what, you know, most people in this country, maybe around the world, get their information from places other than, you know, the Norton anthology of Chekhov short stories. Most people, in fact, get it maybe from media like television and the internet. How do you, if you're invoking clinical medicine, is there a way out of this new fundamentalist paradigm that we've been plunged into in this country, this just polarity? Does it involve some regulations, some of the science that maybe comes out of economics around what the media universe should look like? How do you apply Chekhov to InfoWars and Fox, I guess, and MSNBC for that matter?
I'll just say Fox, you know, if you follow this, Fox is now regarded by the right as much too liberal, and they're abandoning it, you know. So it's going much stronger in that direction, right? More, did you want to?
No, you can go. Keep going. So I'll follow up at the end, maybe.
Well, you know, I'm hoping that people will have a sense that how destructive it is that democracy can't survive when you regard your opponent simply as evil. I mean, if all truth is on one side and the other side is only evil, there's no reason not to have a one-party state and a dictatorship. People sometimes forget that when their party is in control and they've eliminated the possibility of dissent, when their party divides, they might be on the wrong side, and it inevitably will happen. I'm hoping people will begin to realize that this is dangerous, and then you know, go in the other direction. And I'm hoping that our book will kind of be a catalyst or of some sort to, you know, to do that, if it hits at exactly the right moment, and of course other things come together, but we can hope.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, Peter and Saul, is that, you know, a lot of people are talking about that, you know, everybody's so angry and they're screaming at each other and no one's listening and all that, and we're not the only one doing that. But I think that maybe if there's a contribution it's not just that you can learn from great realist novels and short stories, but that there are some common things that have given rise to fundamentalism in economics, in culture, in the humanities, and in politics. And once you recognize the commonality, there might be some way to move beyond it. But we're realistic. Despite all the reviews, most of which were really quite positive and pretty good sales of Sense and Sensibility, my field is impervious to embarrassment. So it's hard to change any field. And we're certainly not going to do it.
Yes, I say, but we can hope. And you're right that I guess one difference in our book is that we talk about 4 different fields and how the same mindset has pervaded all of them, looking for commonalities, which you might not get from looking at any one of them. It's not just a political phenomenon, is our point. It goes across several ways of disciplines and ways of thinking and culture. And you understand it a lot better if you realize it's not just political.
I mean, a final word, and we'll take the next question, Peter, is that going back to Chekhov and his short story Enemies, that people are really angry. They're angry about global pandemic. They're angry about systemic racism, particularly anti-Blackness through the history of this country, among others. They're unhappy about this enormous increase in wealth and income inequality in the US and many other countries after 1979. And one thing that Chekhov argues so brilliantly is that anger can bring people together for common solutions, but it can move them apart. And here's a quote from Enemies. He says, the egoism of the unhappy was conspicuous in both, talking about the doctor, the low-income doctor, and the aristocrat. He said, the unhappy are egoistic, spiteful, unjust, cruel, and less capable of understanding each other than fools. And the result is that even more injustice and cruelty is generated. And I think there are a lot of well-meaning people on both sides of the ideological spectrum, but their wrath and their willingness to do performative actions versus substantive policy actions, have threatened democracy and made this world extremely uneasy and difficult.
Fabulous. I think if more university presidents were quoting Chekhov, we'd be a lot better off. I want to reiterate what I said what I wrote in the chat to everyone of our participants. If there are questions, please post them here in the chat, or if you'd like, we have some minutes left. Unmute and ask on video or through audio. And while people are considering that, I mean, may I put another question to you, which is like, are there any societies in history, any period that have done it just right, in your view, or even any fictional kind of society, utopians or that where some of these things, I don't know, where there was an idyllic period. I don't know whether there's even a month of idyllic time in the Russian or Soviet in Russian history, but maybe somewhere else in Greece, or I'm just curious.
Well, the only thing I'd say, I'll turn it over to Saul in a second, is that it's common to look back at previous periods as the golden age. So whether it's in economics or politics, really, whatever it is, and usually the people at the time, Saul and I edited this book about the future, and that was one of the things we argued. People are always looking back and saying, why can't we be more like that? And it turns out, life expectancy at birth for most of human creation was between 30 and 40. Now it's between 78 and 82. Even the developing world, mainly in the late 60s, early 70s, unless it's just a particularly unusual situation. So, as a number of people argue, these are really great days, but there's also, Peter, a human tendency, I think, to always think that the world's on the precipice of disaster. In fact, the opening Saul, of this book is that. And we quote Marcel Proust, who, to paraphrase him, said that the one thing that every generation has in common is they think they're alive at the most perilous, but also the most important time. So, you know, there's a section about utopias, dystopias in literature that, of course, Saul wrote. So I'll turn it over to him. But Saul, do you think there really was a more golden age in this country or in Russia? No.
There are ever golden ages or idyllic periods, and that's a mistake to look for them, because it comes from the idea that the standard is perfection, and anything less can't be tolerated. So, you know, if, you know, George Washington or Martin Luther King weren't perfect, and we can't have them, right? That's not the way. That guarantees you can't get better. Because no one is perfect and no situation will be perfect. There will always be trade-offs, but things can be a lot better or a lot worse. But you have to look in those terms, in terms of trade-offs, rather than, you know, idyllic periods or golden ages in the past or the future.
Yeah, I'm involved in online course production at MIT in my day job, I think is what I'd call it. I think it'd be great if you could figure out a way for, you know, at least to circulate the reading list that you think everyone should have. And maybe it could be distributed along with a vaccine, like to 325 million people. Your syllabus could get like shot in the arm too. That would be like a Zamyatin, little Zamyatin plot.
What do we know at Pfizer, Morty?
Yeah, who do you know at Pfizer? That's right. That's right. Just have it. Like, you know, those things that you fold out when you read the medical,
yes,
whatever that's called.
We can have some Chekhov included in that.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
Peter,
exactly.
if any listeners here want a copy of the interdisciplinary course that we teach, and we're about to start again soon, we're happy to share that. It doesn't need to be stored at 100 degrees negative Celsius. That's the advantage.
Are you sure? Yeah. We have someone, Zahar Ishov, who says, I might have a comment. And if you do, please post it or unmute. And,
yeah, I would like to make a comment on what you just follow up, because, well, I was just thinking of a piece by Lev Shestov from 1920 on Ruski Bolshevism, of Russian Bolshevism, and what you just brought up, the idea of the golden age. It's pretty much seems that when humanity is going towards the golden age, or something which looks maybe not golden age, but decent developments, then, you know, like it was globalization, and there was a huge backlash against it, and sort of all this slide towards Brexit and sort of Babylonian Tower, and what you're calling a fundamentalist approach, which is basically the when the ability to cooperate or act in concert, as Hannah Arendt would say, stops, and people just tear apart the world. And it's pretty much, you know, pre-World War I world was also going in that direction, and then it all kind of fell apart. So this was a comment on both your presentation. An exciting book, and I'm looking forward to read it.
Thank you. If I can quickly add, one of the things we talk about in the book is that it wasn't a political scientist or any political observer who realizes that sometimes the attempt for utopia, Saul, leads you into what we now call, you know, totalitarianism and the like. It was Dostoevsky who, you know, just read The Possessed, right? So, I mean, God, did he have an accurate, even he didn't wholly imagine the terrors of Lenin, Stalinism, and the like. My God, didn't he come the closest than anybody?
I think he was, so far as I know, he was the only 19th century thinker who said, no, the 20th century will not be just an era of greater liberalism and progress, but we'll have the worst tyranny the world has ever seen. And some of those comments, of Pyotr Stepanovich in Biesi, in The Possessed, are, if not realized in Russia, were realized, let's say, during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It's astonishingly accurate. You want to ask, the question is, how did Dostoevsky know uniquely? And I think the answer is he understood the mindset of the radical intelligentsia and what we would call here its fundamentalism, how far they're willing to push it if they ever got power.
Question, can I?
Yes, I would like you to contribute your question. Let me throw in before you do, and recognizing that we've got about 5 minutes here, 2 from the chat that preceded your intervention, which, just so you know, these are from 2 of our participants, and importantly for you, possibly 2 of your book buyers. Dialogue takes time. Modern people, especially young people, don't want to spend their time on something that doesn't bring financial benefit. And a commentator on that comment wrote, "True, but this need for immediate satisfaction and financial benefit is a disease," that word again, "of capitalism, in my humble opinion." Please ask your question. Perhaps our speakers can address all of them together.
In modern time, Russian authors, writers, the best one, separated in 2 groups. One group says socialism was good and the Soviet Union was good, just Stalin did something wrong. And a good one. And another group is a liberal. They say European way is liberalism is much better and socialism doesn't work. And both are great and influential in Russia now, okay? At the same time, we see China. China has experiment when they have a political power in the Communist Party and actually market an economy. In Russia, after Civil War, there was all destruction of economy, and they tried to put market in economy and keep power in communism, in Bolshevism, whatever. It was new economic policy, and it worked very good, but they stopped it right away for some reason. My question is, and we see here in the United States, a lot of separation between professors in the best universities. Some looking for socialism, some not. Could you explain this separation in mind when we see that actually market work much better?
And could you do it?
There are different kind of questions here, Peter. We have 3 minutes. Did you want to add another one?
No, I don't wish to, but I wish to remind you of that time element. It's kind of like producing a sports event with
Okay. Well, let me do 20 seconds and then Saul gets the minute and a half. I know dialogue, it's sometimes hard to restart, and it's based on, you need some humility, you need some mutual respect, and sometimes it doesn't lead to meaningful change on a timetable that's acceptable. But I'm still hopeful. I'm hopeful because for 42 years in a row, I've taught undergrad, Saul, you're even probably 46 years, and they really do care. They don't always know how to manifest that, but I think they do care, and with a little guidance, this could be a generation. I wrote an op-ed recently saying that, talk about the greatest generation, this generation of Generation Z, bad title for them, but could be the greatest generation 2.0. Saul, last word.
Yeah, we get responses to this class that say, we've never seen anything like this before, how wonderful it is, and it's really changed our way of thinking. So we in the university are in a unique position to show how dialogue works. And we have an audience, and we can be the people who, say, no, financial benefit isn't the only reason you're here, right? You can learn this much deeper way of thinking, which will benefit you personally as well as the world around you. This is our responsibility, and we should not say, you know, it's so hard to do, we won't do it. It's so hard to do, we should do it.
Let me, in an effort to represent everyone who's joined today, thank you so much. We're so grateful for your work and your participation with us today. The book is called, sounds like a public television. The book is called Minds Wide Shut. Is that right? And it's going to be available in the spring. And your course, hopefully we'll get a bit of that inoculation. With the vaccine when it comes around.
And Peter, I'm going to send you the updated syllabus immediately. And if you want to distribute to anybody, feel free to do it.
Fantastic. It gives us some reading during the winter. Thank you so much for this. Again, Morty, Saul, and best to everyone. We're going to start another program right now. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.